recognize Representative Tina SABLAN.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker and colleagues, our budget disagreements with our Senate counterparts, and by extension with the governor, centered largely on questions about the authority of the legislature. Do we have the authority to appropriate and allocate ARPA funding or other outside sources for that matter? Do we have the authority to include taxation provisions in the Appropriations Act? Do we have the power of the purse or not? And ultimately, do we believe that the legislature is a separate and co-equal branch of the government and not merely an extension or puppet of the executive? Colleagues, and I hope that our counterparts in the Senate are listening, just because the governor tells us that we have no authority over ARPA doesn't make it so. The fact is that most legislatures in the nation can and do appropriate the ARPA monies that their states have received, and they have asserted that very authority in their Appropriations Acts. Appropriations Acts are laws. There is nothing in either federal law or CNMI law that says that we, the legislature, may not appropriate ARPA funds. In fact, our statutes, and our colleagues earlier gave a nice summation of all the different statutes that indicate that we can if we choose to do so. In other words, the legislature has that authority if and when the House and the Senate agree to exercise it. The budget that the governor submitted initially in April and then revised in July, and the budget that the Senate has for the most part endorsed, included some glaring deficiencies, as Chairman Manglonia highlighted. 0 for government operations, 0 for the Medicaid match, 0 for the retirees' 25% portion of their pensions. How could we in good conscience endorse that? And then last Friday, the Senate passed their budget version that is problematic to say the least. And it means that all of these key priorities, operations, Medicaid, and retiree pensions, are neglected, underfunded, and insecure. Representative Staffler has highlighted one area of glaring deficiency with respect to the Senate's proposal to use the FEMA Community Disaster Loan Funds based on information they have apparently received from the Governor and Secretary of Finance that there is CDL loan money available to cover at least a portion of retiree pensions and $7.2 million in the local match. But we know, and thank you, Council, for pulling this exhibit up, we know from documents that we had to subpoena from Finance that there's just $36,000 left in that fund. There it is, plain as day, black and white, colleagues, $36,000. So how would the administration cover the rest of the Medicaid match or the rest of the $13 million that we need for retiree pensions? The Senate basically proposes to give the governor unlimited reprogramming power to find that money. And just where do they think he will find that money? Of course, from ARPA. Maybe from FEMA reimbursements that are still coming in. What other significant funding sources are there? He'll reprogram local funds from local accounts to meet that match and then replenish or backfill, as they like to say, those accounts with ARPA money. And no, that is not that much different from what we proposed to do in the House. We were just upfront about it and actually choosing to exercise our authority to move resources around to meet critical needs. The Senate's version merely abdicates that responsibility to the governor. And by the way, I, like Representative Staffler, don't understand at all how the Secretary of Finance can now say that the $20 million that Medicaid just recently returned to the central government is now already spent and was spent on the local stimulus, when the stimulus cards went out months ago. What that tells me is that there is really no controls in this administration over how these funds are being spent or managed. Next, on the tobacco and sugar-sweetened beverage tax provisions that the House included in our version of the budget and which the Senate has opted to delete from theirs. The Senate claims that the inclusion of these tax measures is unconstitutional and violates the one subject rule. And we obviously disagree. And briefly, I'd like to just take a look at what the Constitution, the analysis, and the law actually say. So from Article 2, Section 5, a bill shall be confined to one subject except bills for appropriations. There it is, pretty clear. An appropriation bill shall be limited to the subject of appropriations. And what is an appropriation? So let's take a look at the Planning and Budgeting Act, 1 CMC, Section 7103. An appropriation, we'll give council a second to pull it up. An appropriation means an act of the legislature that allows Commonwealth agencies to incur obligations and make payments from the Treasury for specified purposes. An appropriation is the most common means of providing budget authority. The Planning and Budgeting Act provides broad descriptions elsewhere of what budgets and appropriations acts can encompass. There are references to all sources and all revenues, and there's really no limiting language. And as I believe Vice Chair Karina Magofnia referenced, in 1 CMC Section 7204, the Annual Appropriations Acts shall not appropriate funds in excess of the limits established by the House Concurrent Resolution unless the legislature approves additional taxation. And there it is, 7204B. And like Leader Demapan, I too am troubled by the disagreements among our council, but I'm also troubled, quite frankly, colleagues, by the unnecessary aspersions that have been cast on whether the House did its due diligence, whether we read the analysis. So let's read the analysis, which is not binding, by the way, but we did take a look at the analysis. And the analysis of the Constitution treats the executive budget separately from the appropriations acts and the revenue bills that the House passes, that the legislature passes. And from the analysis, the executive budget must describe all anticipated revenues and proposed expenditures of the Commonwealth. It is intended that the budget be a unified budget dealing with all revenues available to the Commonwealth, and the legislature may approve, modify, or reject the governor's budget. The analysis discusses the budget proposal separately from legislation, including appropriations acts, and it describes the budget document, so what the governor gives us as a plan, and it is not itself legislation with respect to raising revenue or authorizing or appropriating CNMI funds. But the governor may submit to the legislature, among other things, the proposed budget and recommendations with respect to legislation on taxation. Did the governor's budget submission for fiscal year 2023 include a proposal to raise taxes on tobacco and sugar-sweetened beverages? Yes, it did. Clear as day on page 5 of Governor's Communication 22-120 on April 1st. It also actually included alcohol taxes, for everybody's information, and referenced the recommendations from the Fiscal Response Summit of 2020. In the House Appropriations Act, we opted to include the provisions on tobacco and SSBs because that legislation were ready to go, and we needed to identify funding sources for the Commonwealth Healthcare Corporation to support operations, medical referral, and public health initiatives. And in our budget bill, we both raise revenues from tobacco and SSBs and appropriate those revenues to CHCC. Tobacco and SSB taxes were, by the way, strongly recommended by healthcare officials and advocates at the NCD Summit last July. as effective policy tools to help combat another ongoing public health emergency that is threatening this community, and that's NCDs, diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. And in fact, the House has passed one of these standalone bills on tobacco taxation over a year ago, and that bill still sits in the Senate. If our colleagues in the Senate are listening, and hopefully they are, I would urge them to act on that legislation as soon as possible. The Senate does a few other things too, and I'm coming to the end, Mr. Speaker. First, I think it should be clear that the House only converted the legislature's budget to the general fund and actually reduces funding levels that we are utilizing in this current fiscal year. It's the Senate that increases leadership funding in their budget version. And it's also the Senate, by the way, that deletes the restriction on the use of public funds to pay for the utility bills of elected officials like the governor. The Senate also violates their own supposed one-subject rule by creating whole new offices in the form of these new liaison offices that will be established in multiple places off-island, supposedly to assist medical referral patients and other CNMI residents. How on earth is this justified? Where is the data to show the need for this? And how can we afford this? And really, the question that is burning in my mind, colleagues, let's be honest, who does the administration have in mind for more new and wasteful contracts? Let's also remember that the reason that medical referral was returned to CHC in the first place is that there was never any legal authority for the governor to run that program. There was never any enabling legislation. And that was why we acted with urgency on legislation to reform and restructure the medical referral program. And that bill was passed too, by the way, to the Senate months ago. And there were plenty of complaints, colleague Ada, about the way that medical referral services were being provided when it was under the office of the governor too. I'd like to remind us all, colleagues, that the CNMI government was bleeding, running into deficits. There were no standard operating procedures, not to mention millions of legally invalid promissory notes that we will probably never collect on. This hasn't been a perfect transition at all. But now that CHCC is working valiantly to right this ship and make this program one that is sustainable, this administration and our colleagues in the Senate want us to go backwards, to establish new and duplicative offices and repeat history. The administration still owes millions to CHCC. It's September 27th, 3 days before the end of this fiscal year, including millions for medical referral. How about we give them their money? So to return to the questions I asked at the beginning, yes, we do have the authority to appropriate and allocate ARPA funding if the legislature chooses to exercise that authority. Yes, we do have the authority to include taxation provisions in the Appropriations Acts and appropriate those new revenues as we see fit. Yes, we do have the power of the purse if we choose to claim it. And yes, the legislature is a separate and co-equal branch of the government and not merely a puppet of the executive, if we choose to act like it. I support the rejection of the Senate version of the budget, and I'm ready to vote.
Thank you.